Granite County, Montana Territory, August 1888. The heat was a liar. It was a temporary, desperate guest that overstayed its welcome, making the residents forget the true landlord of this place. The true landlord was the cold, and it was merely away on business. It would be back, and it would collect its rent in firewood, in livestock, and sometimes in people. Anya Jensen knew this. She felt it in the marrow of her bones, a deep ancestral chill that had nothing to do with the sweat on her brow. She stood on the slight rise of her property, 160 acres of grudging soil and endless sky that her husband Eric had claimed before a logging accident had claimed him. Now it was just her and their 7-year-old son, Lars. A widow and an orphan, clinging to a patch of dirt on the edge of the world. Her cabin was small but sturdy, built by Eric's own hands from lodgepole pine. It was a good cabin, as far as cabins went, but it was also an island. 150 feet away, a similar island of wood rose from the prairie grass, the barn. It housed their 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and the old draft horse that was now her primary partner in this venture of survival. 150 feet. In the deceptive August sun, it was a pleasant stroll. In January, it was a journey across a polar wasteland. Last winter had been her first alone. It had nearly been her last. She remembered the routine, seared into her memory like a brand. Waking in the sub-zero darkness, the inside of the cabin windows thick with frost flowers. Forcing down a lump of cold bread in lukewarm water because the fire had died to embers. Then the ritual of layering, wool upon wool, a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped so tightly around her face that only her eyes were exposed. Then, the plunge. Opening the cabin door was like opening an airlock into the void. The wind, a physical entity, would slam into her, stealing her breath and burning her exposed skin. The 150 feet to the barn became a battle. The snow would be thigh-deep, sometimes waist-deep, a relentless, clinging enemy. Every step was a monumental effort of will. She would reach the barn, her lungs screaming, her body already losing its precious heat, only to find the real work had just begun. Breaking the ice in the water trough, forking hay to the shivering animals, their breath pluming in the frigid air, collecting the few precious eggs, often finding them frozen solid in the nesting boxes. Then the journey back. A retreat against the same enemy, now with the added burden of milk pails whose contents would begin to freeze on the walk back. She would stumble back into the cabin, exhausted, half frozen, and spend the next hour huddled by the stove, feeding it log after log, just to reclaim the body heat she had lost in a 20-minute chore. She did this twice a day, every day, for 5 months. She had burned through a staggering amount of their wood supply, not to heat the house, but simply to recover from the cold. It was a cycle of profound, unsustainable waste. She was fighting a war of attrition against the winter, and she was losing. One sweltering afternoon in late August, while sorting through Eric's old sea chest, she found them. Rolled into a tight tube and bound with a leather thong were his old shipbuilding diagrams from his apprenticeship in Denmark. He had been a shipwright before the promise of land had lured him to America. Anya unrolled the brittle paper on the floor. They were beautiful, intricate drawings of hulls and keels, cross-sections of brigs and schooners. Lars came over, his small finger tracing the elegant lines. Anya wasn't looking at the ships. She was looking at the spaces between the lines. She was looking at the way the Danish designers managed air and water, the way they built for resilience against the relentless North Sea gales. They didn't just build walls to block the wind. They built structures that understood the wind, that channeled it, that used its own principles against it. They built for efficiency, because on a long sea voyage, waste was death, just as it was here. Her eyes fixed on a cross-section of a hull, showing the tight framing, the insulation packed between the inner and outer walls. She saw diagrams for ventilation, for moving air through the tight, damp confines of a ship's lower decks to keep them from turning into a swamp of rot and disease. They used small, cleverly placed vents to create a natural draw, a slow but constant circulation powered by nothing more than the temperature differences between one part of the ship and another. An idea began to form. It was a radical, almost laughable notion. It wasn't about building a better wall. It was about eliminating the journey. It was about connecting the two islands, the cabin and the barn. Not with a surface structure that the wind and snow would tear apart, but by going down, by going into the one thing that was immune to the winter wind, the earth itself. She would dig a tunnel. It would start in the root cellar, which was already halfway there, its earthen walls a testament to the planet's insulating power. It would extend, straight and true, 150 feet to the foundation of the barn, emerging near the feed storage area. It would be a covered walkway, a subterranean artery connecting the heart of her home to the heart of her livelihood. The work began the next day. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. First, she and Lars cleared the root cellar. Then, with a pickaxe and a shovel Eric had left behind, she attacked the far earthen wall. The soil was dense, packed clay mixed with a frustrating amount of rock. Each swing of the pickaxe was a jarring shock that ran up her arms and into her shoulders. She would loosen the earth, then shovel it into buckets, which Lars, feeling immensely important, would haul up the cellar stairs and dump in a growing pile behind the cabin. They worked from sunup to sundown. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, blistered, then bled, then formed new, tougher calluses. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out. But with every bucket of earth hauled away, with every inch of darkness she carved into the soil, the vision became clearer. She wasn't just digging a hole. She was building a solution. She was forging a weapon against the coming winter. Word travels fast in a small community, especially when it concerns something unusual. By the second week, when a long, deep trench began to snake its way from her cabin towards her barn, the neighbors started to notice. The first was Mr. Henderson, who rode by on his horse, pausing for a long time to stare at the growing mound of dirt. He tipped his hat, a confused look on his face, and rode on. By the third week, the trench was over 4 feet deep and nearly 30 feet long. The talk in the nearby settlement of Prairie Light had begun. It started as murmurs, as confused questions. What was the widow Jensen doing? Was she digging a new well? An irrigation ditch? No. It seemed to be going from her house to her barn. The initial confusion soon curdled into amusement, and then into open mockery. They called it Anya's Folly. Some, more cruelly, called it the Danish prairie dog hole. The consensus was that the poor woman's grief had finally unsettled her mind. Why would anyone expend that much energy on a glorified ditch? A ditch that would surely collapse in the first heavy rain or fill with snow come winter. It was a monumental waste of time and effort that could be better spent chopping wood or mending fences. The voice of this consensus, the man who gave it weight and authority, was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was the closest thing Prairie Light had to an patriarch. He was a successful rancher and the town's most respected builder. He had raised half the barns in the county, including Anya's. He was a man who understood wood and stone and the practical, hard-won truths of building for a Montana winter. He believed in thick walls, good mortar, and a steep roof to shed the snow. His methods were tested and trusted. One afternoon, he rode out to Anya's homestead, dismounting with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who believes he is about to do someone a favor. He found her in the trench, her face smeared with dirt, her dress stained with sweat. She was leveraging a large rock out of the clay with a long iron bar. "Mistress Jensen," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not offer to help. Anya paused, breathing heavily, and looked up at him. She shielded her eyes from the sun. "Mr. Blackwood." "The folks in town are talking," he began, getting straight to the point. "They're concerned. I'm concerned." He gestured with a thick, calloused hand at the trench. "What is the purpose of this endeavor?" "It is a passage," Anya said simply, her English still carrying the clipped, melodic cadence of her native Danish. "From the house to the barn." Blackwood almost smiled, but caught himself. He was here to be kind, to guide the poor widow away from her madness. "A passage, I see. And you intend to walk through this trench in the middle of a blizzard?" "It will be covered," she said, turning back to the rock. This gave him pause. "Covered? With what? Timbers? Planks? Woman, the snow load here can reach 400 pounds per square foot. Whatever you put on top of this will collapse before Christmas. It will be a death trap. You are digging your own grave." "The roof will hold," Anya stated. It was not a hope. It was a fact. Blackwood's patience began to fray. He saw this not just as foolishness, but as an insult to his craft. He was the builder. He knew the rules. "And the damp?" he pressed. "An underground passage will fill with moisture. It will be a tunnel of ice. The air will be foul. It's unnatural. A home is meant to be on the earth, not in it. We are not badgers." Anya finally stopped her work and looked at him directly. Her blue eyes were clear and steady. "In the sea, Mr. Blackwood, you must work with the pressure, not against it. You must understand the flow. The earth is the same. It is not the enemy. The cold is the enemy. The wind is the enemy. The earth is a shield." He stared at her, utterly baffled by her cryptic, nonsensical talk of the sea. They were 1,000 miles from any ocean. "This is not the sea, Mistress Jensen. This is Montana. You are wasting precious time. Winter is coming. You should be cutting wood, not digging this folly." He had said the word, the official name. Anya's folly. "My wood will last longer than yours, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not wasting heat on the journey. I am making the journey part of the home." He was not wrong by the standards of his world. He was speaking from a lifetime of hard-earned practical experience. A structure like Anya's tunnel was, by all conventional wisdom, doomed to fail. It defied the established principles of frontier construction. Blackwood saw a hole in the ground, a future collapse, a haven for dampness and foul air. He saw a liability. Anya saw a thermal battery. The narrative of her folly paused, and the physics of her wisdom took center stage. What Blackwood and the others failed to comprehend was that Anya was not merely digging a ditch. She was constructing a highly efficient, passive geothermal system based on principles that were centuries old, honed in the harsh environments of coastal Scandinavia. Her project was an elegant synthesis of earth science, thermodynamics, and shipbuilding engineering. The first principle was thermal mass. The Earth itself possesses an enormous capacity to absorb and store thermal energy. Below the frost line, which in Montana could be 4 or 5 feet deep, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season. A conventional log cabin, sitting on top of the frozen ground, was a wooden box fighting a direct war with the ambient air temperature, which could plummet to 40 below zero. The cabin's only defense was its insulation, the logs themselves, and the constant, ravenous consumption of firewood. It was a thermal sieve, constantly leaking precious heat into the hostile environment. Anya's tunnel, by contrast, was nestled deep within this thermal battery. Its floor was 6 feet below the surface, well beneath the frost line. The surrounding earth wasn't a cold to be fought, but a massive, stable reservoir of moderate temperature. The earthen walls of her tunnel would constantly radiate a baseline temperature of around 50 degrees. It wouldn't be warm, but critically, it would never be freezing. The battle wasn't to heat the tunnel from 40 below to a livable temperature. The battle was merely to keep a space that was already 50 degrees from losing its heat. This was an exponentially easier and more efficient task. The second principle was insulation, but applied intelligently. Blackwood was right that a simple plank roof would collapse. Anya knew this. Her design was far more robust. She used thick, load-bearing timbers for the primary frame, spaced closely together, much like the ribs of a ship's hull, designed to withstand the immense pressure of the sea. This was Eric's knowledge, resurrected. Across these timbers, she laid a double layer of thick planks. But this was only the beginning. On top of the planks, she placed a thick layer of packed straw for insulation. And atop that, she carefully replaced the very sod and earth she had excavated, creating a roof of living soil nearly 2 feet thick. This massive earthen layer not only provided insulation on a scale a log cabin could only dream of, in R value dozens of times higher, but its sheer weight also helped to stabilize the entire structure, locking the timbers into place. To an observer, once the grass grew back, the tunnel would be almost invisible, a mere swelling in the landscape. The final principle, the most subtle and ingenious, was airflow management. This was the true ghost of the Danish shipwrights in her design. Blackwood's concern about foul, damp air was valid for a simple, sealed hole in the ground. Anya's tunnel, however, was designed to breathe. She constructed 2 small, discrete ventilation shafts, one near the cabin entrance and one at the barn end. These were not large openings. They were narrow, stone-lined shafts that terminated on the surface, cleverly disguised within piles of fieldstone that looked like natural features of the landscape. Herein lay the genius. The barn, full of livestock, was a source of constant, low-grade heat. The collective body heat of the cows and horse would keep the air in the barn significantly warmer than the air in the tunnel. The cabin's root cellar, conversely, was the coolest point in the system. This temperature differential, a basic law of physics, created a natural and constant convection current. The warmer, lighter air from the barn would be drawn into the tunnel, while the cooler, denser air from the cellar end would sink, pushing air through the system. A tiny, almost imperceptible breeze would constantly circulate through the passage. This slow, steady draw, exactly like the ventilation systems on Eric's diagrams, would prevent moisture from building up, keep the air fresh, and slowly pull a bit of the animal's warmth down the length of the passage. She was making the smoke, or in this case the heat, pay rent. Compared to this, the conventional methods were tragically wasteful. A standard frontier fireplace was an open wound in the wall, with as much as 90% of its heat going straight up the chimney. A cast iron stove was better, but it still fought a losing battle against the poorly insulated walls and single-pane windows of a typical cabin. The occupants of such a home lived in a small bubble of warmth around the stove, while the corners of the room remained freezing. Anya's system integrated her entire homestead, cabin, passage, and barn into a single, unified thermal entity. It was not a house fighting the winter. It was a small ecosystem designed to coexist with it. She was not imposing her will on the land. She was listening to its fundamental laws and building in harmony with them. The folly was not her tunnel. The folly was trying to live in a wooden tent in the middle of a frozen hell, and believing a big enough fire was the only answer. By mid-October, the tunnel was complete. The last of the sod was laid on the roof, and from the outside it was little more than a gentle ridge in the earth. The two stone piles that marked the vents looked as if they had been there for a century. The interior was a marvel of rustic, functional engineering. It was about 5 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall, allowing her to walk its length without stooping. The walls were packed earth, and the timbered ceiling felt as solid as a mountain. She had installed a heavy, insulated door at the cellar entrance and a similar one at the barn end. The air inside was cool, smelling of damp earth and fresh-cut pine, but it was not cold. It was still. Lars loved it. It was their secret passage, their fortress. He would run its length, his whoops and hollers echoing in the enclosed space. For him, it was a game. For Anya, it was a shield. She spent the remaining weeks of autumn in a frenzy of normal preparations, cutting the last of the wood, harvesting from her garden, and storing provisions. But she did so with a sense of calm that she had not felt since Eric was alive. Let the winter come. She was ready. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. It began in late November with a series of snowfalls that laid a deep, lasting blanket over the land. By December, the temperature was routinely dropping below zero at night. The residents of Prairie Light settled into their yearly battle. The sound of axes splitting wood was constant. The smoke from their chimneys was a desperate signal of life. Anya's life, however, had transformed. Her morning routine was no longer a plunge into a frozen hell. She would wake, dress in simple indoor clothes, and walk to the cellar door. Opening it revealed not a howling gale, but the cool, quiet stillness of the tunnel. She would take a lantern and walk the 150 feet underground. The air was brisk, but never painfully cold. She could feel the faint, slow current of air on her cheek. She would emerge in the barn into the welcome warmth of the animals, their soft lowing a gentle greeting. She would do her chores, milking, feeding, watering, unhurried, unburdened by the need to race against the encroaching frostbite. She carried the milk back through the tunnel, and it arrived in her kitchen, still warm from the cow. She was using less than a third of the firewood she had burned the previous year. Her large fire was for cooking and for a comfortable warmth in the main room. She was no longer spending her energy merely recovering from the cold. Her days were calmer, more productive. She had time to mend clothes, to read to Lars, to properly tend to her animals. While her neighbors were engaged in a desperate, full-time fight for survival, Anya was simply living. The talk in town continued, but its tone began to shift. They saw that she was surviving. They saw that her chimney produced a steady but not frantic plume of smoke. They assumed she had simply been lucky so far, that a true test had not yet come. Silas Blackwood saw her at the general store once, looking healthy and rested. He chalked it up to a widow's resilience, but a seed of doubt, tiny and unwelcome, had been planted in his mind. The true test arrived on the 12th of January, 1889. History would remember it as the Great Blizzard, a storm of legendary ferocity that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The day began deceptively mild for January. The sky was a low, gray ceiling. But then, in the early afternoon, the temperature plummeted with shocking speed. A wall of white descended upon the plains, and the wind began to howl, a rising demonic shriek that rattled windows and shook the very foundations of the cabins. It was a true whiteout. Visibility dropped to zero. The world was reduced to a swirling vortex of snow and wind. The temperature fell to 20 below, then 30, then 40 below zero. The wind chill was a lethal, unimaginable number. To be caught outside was a death sentence. Inside his large, well-built ranch house, Silas Blackwood felt the cold for the first time not as a nuisance, but as a predator. It forced its way through every tiny crack in the walls. It radiated from the windows in waves. His family, huddled around the massive stone fireplace, had to wear their coats indoors. The fire, which he and his sons fed constantly, seemed to provide only a small circle of heat, beyond which the cold ruled. The wind screamed at them, a constant reminder of their fragility. His thoughts turned to his livestock, to the 100 head of cattle in his large, sturdy barn 200 feet from the house. They needed water. The pumps would be frozen. They would have to break the ice. The trip was a necessity. He and his eldest son, Thomas, bundled themselves up as if for an Arctic expedition. The moment they opened the door, the storm punched them in the face. They fought their way to the barn, following a rope line they had strung up for just such an occasion. They couldn't see their own feet. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from the rope, from the world itself. They made it to the barn, gasping, their faces already numb with frostbite. They spent 40 minutes of desperate, frantic work inside, then faced the terrifying journey back. By the time they fell back into the house, they were exhausted, ice-caked, and shaking uncontrollably. They had risked their lives for a single trip, and they would have to do it again in the evening. The conventional way was failing. In her small cabin, Anya Jensen sat with Lars by her modest stove, reading a book. The wind howled outside, a distant, frustrated beast clawing at a fortress it could not breach. The cabin was warm, not hot, but a comfortable, even temperature. Her little kingdom was secure. When it was time for the evening chores, she lit her lantern. "Time to see the cows, little one," she said to Lars. He put on his small boots, but no coat. They walked to the cellar, opened the heavy door, and stepped into the tunnel. The transition was remarkable. The roar of the blizzard vanished, replaced by a profound, muffled silence. The air in the tunnel was still and cool, holding steady at its baseline of nearly 50 degrees. There was no wind. There was no snow. There was only the straight, secure path ahead, illuminated by the gentle glow of their lantern. They walked the 150 feet in perfect safety and relative comfort. Inside the barn, the animals were calm. They were insulated from the storm's fury, their own body heat keeping the large space above freezing. Anya did her work with the same methodical calm as always. She checked on a new calf that had been born the day before, ensuring it was warm and nursing. Such a thing would have been a crisis for any other homesteader during this storm. The calf would have likely frozen. Here, it was merely another life to be tended. She and Lars walked back through the tunnel, carrying the milk and a few eggs. They closed the cellar door behind them, shutting out the cool of the passage and re-entering the warmth of their home. The predator raging outside could not touch them. Her design had not just been a success, it was a triumph. She had used intelligence and a forgotten wisdom to build a sanctuary, while her neighbors, who had mocked her, were prisoners in their own homes, fighting a desperate battle against an enemy that was already inside their walls. The blizzard raged for 3 days. 3 days of relentless wind and blinding snow. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, it revealed a world transformed, buried, and broken. The sun shone on a landscape of immense, sculpted drifts, some as high as the cabin roofs. It was a world of profound silence. Slowly, the survivors began to dig themselves out. The news that trickled through the community was grim. John Carter had lost nearly half his herd, frozen in their field. The miller's barn roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Old Man Hemlock was found in his cabin, frozen solid in his chair, his woodpile empty. The storm had taken its rent. Silas Blackwood had survived, but he was a changed man. He had lost a dozen cattle, but more than that, he had lost his certainty. His methods, the ones he had preached and built his reputation on, had been found wanting. They had been tested by a true Montana winter and had nearly failed. He had felt the cold's teeth, and the experience had shaken him to his core. On the second day after the storm, after digging a path from his own home, he put on his snowshoes and began the long, arduous trek to Anya Jensen's property. He did not know what he expected to find. He feared the worst. He imagined the quiet widow and her son, huddled and frozen. It was a grim duty, a penance for his mockery. As he crested the final rise, he saw it. A thin, steady curl of smoke rising from her chimney. Not the frantic, desperate plume of a house fighting for its life, but the calm, measured breath of a home at peace. He saw a narrow path shoveled from her door to the slight ridge in the snow that he now realized was the roof of her tunnel. He trudged to her door and knocked. Anya opened it. She was not wearing a heavy coat. Her face was not etched with the exhaustion and fear he saw in everyone else. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Mistress Jensen," he said, his voice hoarse. "You are well." "We are," she said. "Please, come in." The warmth inside the cabin was the first shock. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. The air was fresh. The boy, Lars, was playing on the floor with wooden toys, looking healthy and content. It was a scene of impossible domestic tranquility. Blackwood stood there, his hat in his hands, a giant of a man suddenly feeling small. I lost 12 head, he confessed, the words tasting like ash. Nearly lost my son to frostbite trying to reach them. Anya just nodded, a deep and knowing sadness in her eyes. She did not say, "I told you so." There was no hint of triumph in her demeanor. There was only a quiet, powerful grace. "My animals are well," she said softly. "The new calf is strong." He could not comprehend it. "How?" he finally whispered, the one word encompassing all of his shattered certainties. "How did you manage?" Anya looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a lantern from the table. "Let me show you," she said. She led him not to the front door, but to the door of the root cellar. She opened it, and he was met with a rush of cool, earthy air. He followed her down the steps. She lit the lantern, and its light filled the subterranean passage. Blackwood stopped at the entrance, staring down its length. It was not a collapsed, icy tomb. It was a clean, solid, functional corridor. It was real. "Walk with me," Anya said. He stepped into the tunnel. The second shock was the silence. The ever-present Montana wind, which had been his constant companion and tormentor for 50 years, was gone. The air was absolutely still. The third shock was the temperature. It was cool, yes, but he could feel with a builder's instinct that it was far, far above freezing. He reached out and touched the packed earth wall. It was cool and firm, not slick with ice. He looked up at the timbered ceiling. It was solid, bearing its immense load of earth and snow without a hint of strain. They walked the full 150 feet in that profound silence. At the far end, Anya opened the door to the barn. A wave of warm, animal-scented air washed over them. The cows looked up from their hay, placid and content. The chickens clucked softly. It was an oasis of life, utterly untouched by the Arctic devastation outside. Blackwood stood there in the middle of the barn, turning slowly, taking it all in. He looked back down the tunnel, then at the healthy animals, then at the quiet woman holding the lantern. He finally understood. She had not dug a grave. She had built an ark. He walked back through the tunnel, his mind racing, reevaluating every principle he had ever held. He saw it now not as a whole, but as a system, a brilliant, elegant, living system. He saw the genius in its use of the earth, its management of air, its profound efficiency. He saw the wisdom of the sea brought to the prairie. When they were back in her warm cabin, he turned to her, his face a mask of humility and awe. "Mistress Jensen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I called this a folly. I was the fool." He cleared his throat. "I ask you, would you teach me the principles?" That spring, Silas Blackwood, the most respected builder in the county, became Anya Jensen's first student. He did not just help her, he studied under her. He learned about thermal mass and convection, about shipbuilding frames and the quiet power of the earth. The following summer, the first Jensen Passage, as they came to be known, was built on the Blackwood Ranch. The summer after that, 3 more were constructed. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. They stopped calling her the crazy Danish widow. They started calling her the woman who understood winter. Anya Jensen lived a long and peaceful life in her small cabin. She never remarried, but she was never alone. She became the heart of her community, a quiet pillar of a new kind of wisdom. The passages became a signature of the regional architecture, a testament to the day that a lone immigrant widow, armed with a shovel and the forgotten knowledge of the sea, taught a town of hardened pioneers how to truly make a home in that beautiful and brutal land. Her legacy was written not in stone, but in the earth itself. It was a legacy of connection, of foresight, of the quiet, unassailable power of a good idea. Years later, when asked about her triumph, she would simply touch the wall of her cabin and say, "Fire is a gift for a moment, but the earth is a gift for a lifetime. You just have to know how to accept it." She understood that true resilience wasn't about fighting nature with more force, but about finding the quiet spaces where nature's own laws offered you shelter. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a composite narrative designed to illustrate principles of ingenuity and survival. The content does not constitute professional architectural or engineering advice. The world told Anya Jensen that her idea was unnatural, that it was a foolish hole in the ground. But she knew that the most unnatural thing of all was to live in a box that leaked life and heat into the killing cold, fighting the same losing battle year after year. Her solution was found by looking down, by looking within, by listening to a different kind of wisdom. So the question is, what conventional walls are you hiding behind? What tunnel are you being told not to dig? And what forgotten wisdom from your own ancestors are you ignoring?